Imagine it's a stormy night, one of those nights where the wind howls through the trees and the rain beats against your windows like 1,000 tiny hands tapping, pleading to be let in. You're at home, tucked into the warm comfort of your bed, trying to relax as the storm rages outside. The sound of the rain should be soothing, but something feels off. The storm doesn't feel natural. It feels like it's hiding something waiting for you, just beyond your reach. Outside, the world is dark, shrouded in shadow, every corner bathed in the soft glow of flickering streetlights. The kind of night where every movement, every sound, seems louder, more pronounced. The sound of rain, now deafening, only adds to the tension, creating an eerie calm before the storm truly reveals itself. You lie there, listening to the rhythmic beat of the rain against your window, but then something changes. A soft tap. It's faint at first, almost as though you imagined it, but as the wind picks up, you hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. Slowly, deliberately. Your heart skips a beat. You try to tell yourself it's nothing. Maybe the wind has moved something against the glass. Maybe it's a tree branch brushing against the window. But deep down, you know that's not it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound is sharper now, more insistent. It's coming from somewhere outside, but it doesn't sound like anything natural. It's too rhythmic, too deliberate. Your heart starts to race. You get out of bed and walk toward the window, each step heavy, your breath shallow, as though the air itself is thick with tension. You hesitate. A small part of you wonders if you should just ignore it, retreat back into the warmth of your blankets. But another part, the darker part of your mind, urges you forward. What if it's something, or someone, out there, trying to get in? You pull back the curtain, your hands shaking. Nothing. Just rain, wind, darkness. No one. You let out a sigh of relief, convincing yourself that it was just your imagination playing tricks on you. But as you step back, ready to turn away, you hear it again. That tap. A single tap this time. But there's something different about it. It's closer. It sounds closer than before. And then the next tap comes, and another. Tap, tap, tap. Your pulse quickens. The tapping grows louder, faster. It's almost as if it's following you. Your mind races, desperately searching for a logical explanation. Maybe someone's playing a prank, or it's an animal seeking shelter. But there's one thing you can't shake off. There's no wind, no branches, no animals. And then, the whisper. It's faint at first, just a shift in the air, something you thought was just the storm. But now it's unmistakable. A whisper, soft and close, like someone standing right behind you. You freeze, your blood running cold, your breath catching in your throat. Help me? The voice is barely a whisper, but it's enough to make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. You turn around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there's nothing, no one. You're alone. Yet that voice still lingers in your ears, echoing through the silence, like a call from the other side. Your heart races, panic surging through you. What do you do? Do you lock the door, close the window, and try to forget it? Or do you confront whatever is out there, behind the glass, just beyond your reach? You know you should leave it alone, but something in you compels you to look. What if it's a person? What if it's something worse? You walk closer to the window again, your pulse thundering in your ears, your fingers trembling as you pull back the curtain. And then you see it. A figure. Barely visible. Almost a shadow blending with the storm. Just a glimpse of a silhouette. But it's enough to make your blood run cold. It's standing right outside your window, facing you, but it doesn't move. It doesn't blink. It just stares. The figure's presence is so unsettling, it feels as though the world has stopped, and all that's left is you and that unblinking, motionless shape in the rain. You step back, heart pounding, but your feet feel rooted to the floor. The air is thick with the scent of wet earth and something else. Something is wrong. And then you hear it again. The whisper. A little louder this time. Clearer. Let me in. And that's when you realize the storm isn't what's keeping you inside. The storm isn't the thing you should be afraid of tonight. No, it's what's standing out there in the dark, waiting for you to make the wrong move. What if the rain isn't hiding the horrors, but calling them? It had been hours since the storm started, a furious torrent of rain that seemed to batter the earth as though seeking to destroy everything in its path. The wind howled in gusts that shook the trees and caused the branches to groan like old men struggling to hold their ground. The traveler, soaked to the bone and desperate for shelter, stumbled through the dense woods, eyes squinting against the sheets of rain. His name was Adam, and he'd been hiking for what felt like days, hoping to reach a remote trailhead. But the storm, wild and unpredictable, had trapped him in the woods. He knew he couldn't risk going any further. He was lost, and the storm was growing worse by the minute. Through the fog of his fatigue, he saw it. An old cabin in the distance, its silhouette barely visible through the thick mist and rain. His heart leapt with relief. He stumbled toward it, unsure of what to expect, but desperate for any kind of shelter. The door creaked open with an eerie groan as Adam pushed it inward, his breath fogging in the cold air that rushed inside. The place looked abandoned, with layers of dust on every surface, the wood of the floor warped and uneven. But it was dry, and that was all that mattered. He kicked off his boots and peeled off his drenched clothes, seeking warmth by the small, flickering fireplace. At first, everything felt normal, almost comforting. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Adam sank into a dusty old chair, thankful for the warmth. He pulled out his phone, but, of course, there was no signal. The storm had likely knocked out any nearby towers. He settled back, closing his eyes, the sounds of the storm outside becoming a dull roar. It was peaceful, almost. Too peaceful. Then it started. A creak from the far corner of the cabin broke the silence. Adam opened his eyes, suddenly alert. He glanced around. The floorboards in the back of the room shifted slightly, the sound of the wood stretching under some unseen pressure. He thought it was the wind. Maybe the cabin itself was just old, settling into the storm. But then there was another sound. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "Hello?" Adam called, his voice shaky despite his attempt at calm. No answer. Shaking his head, Adam turned his attention back to the fire. He convinced himself that it was just his mind playing tricks, tired, wet, and alone in a strange place. But then there was the sound again, this time louder. A scraping noise, something shifting, dragging across the floor. He stood up quickly, eyes scanning the cabin, heart beginning to race. It was coming from the small room at the back of the cabin. His breath hitched in his chest as the unease grew. He forced his legs to move, every step heavy with dread. The back room was dark, the air thick with mildew and the scent of something old. He reached the threshold, flicking on a light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb flickered a few times, buzzing before going out entirely, leaving him in a swath of thick blackness. He stood there, unable to move, his body frozen by a primal fear he couldn't quite understand. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his chest, a constant reminder of how alone he was in this remote, forsaken cabin. Then, in the darkness, something shifted. Adam's breath caught. He could just make out the shape of a rocking chair in the corner of the room, its seat creaking gently, though no one was sitting in it. He took a step forward, each movement slow, deliberate, as if he were afraid that rushing would make whatever was in the room notice him. But the rocking chair continued to move, slowly, unnaturally, creaking with every back-and-forth motion. Then came the whisper, louder this time, echoing off the walls. "Help me!" Adam spun around, eyes wide, every nerve in his body on high alert. He turned back to the rocking chair, and for a brief moment he swore he saw the faint outline of a figure sitting in it, its head tilted back, an empty, hollow face staring at him. His breath hitched. It couldn't be real. It couldn't. But as his mind raced to explain away the hallucination, he saw the chair move again, this time at a more frantic pace, creaking louder and louder, as if something unseen was desperately trying to get his attention. He could feel the temperature drop in the room, the air turning heavy and oppressive, suffocating him as if the very atmosphere had thickened with dread. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to escape, but his feet felt as though they were glued to the floor, unable to move, as if the cabin itself was holding him there. Then, as if in slow motion, the air shifted again, and a new sound emerged, a soft scraping noise, like nails against wood. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Adam's pulse quickened as he watched the wooden planks of the wall near the rocking chair warp, as though something was pressing against them from the other side, forcing the walls to buckle. The temperature dropped further. His breath was now visible, each exhale a cloud of vapor, and his skin tingle with cold, the hair on his arms standing on end. And then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow, dark and jagged, moved across the room like liquid night, creeping up the walls and slithering along the floor. It was fast, moving with a sickening speed that made Adam's stomach churn. He spun around, his heart racing, only to find the shadow had vanished, leaving behind nothing but the chilling cold and the creaking of the floorboards. The whisper was louder now, almost as if it were right behind him, breathing down his neck. "Help me. Please, ... Before he could react, the rocking chair suddenly flew back, crashing into the wall with a deafening thud. Adam let out a strangled scream, stumbling back. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, staring at the corner of the room where the figure had once sat. Then, in the silence that followed, a figure stepped forward from the darkness. A gaunt, pale face emerged, framed by unkempt hair that hung limp around its hollow eyes. Its mouth was twisted in an agonizing grin, and its body seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if it were trapped between worlds. Adam's heart stopped. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His body felt heavy, as if gravity itself had turned against him. The figure floated toward him, the space between them growing impossibly small. "Help me," it whispered again, its voice a ragged breath full of sorrow and despair. Adam's mind raced. The stories, the rumors, the strange happenings around this cabin. It was all true. The man who had lived here before him had vanished without a trace, his belongings abandoned as if he had simply disappeared in the middle of the night. But the truth was far worse than anyone had imagined. The cabin, the land, it was cursed, tainted by something dark and ancient, something that hungered for the souls of those who dared to stay. Adam tried to move, but his limbs were frozen, his eyes locked, with the apparition's hollow gaze. He could feel it drawing closer, a cold, suffocating presence that threatened to swallow him whole. He was caught in the storm, caught in the curse that had claimed the man before him. And now it was his turn. The last thing Adam saw was the figure's smile, its eyes empty, before everything went black. The woods had always been a place of solace for Daniel. A seasoned hiker, he had spent countless hours wandering through dense forests, finding peace in the quiet rustle of leaves and the serene hush of nature. But that night, the storm was different. It was as if the forest itself was alive, twisting, shifting, angry. The wind had started as a gentle breeze, but now it was howling, a savage force that pushed him forward, making every step feel like an uphill battle. The trees bent in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning as if protesting the storm's fury. Daniel had been hiking for hours when the storm hit. He hadn't planned for it. He had underestimated the weather, as many do when they're too eager to explore. But now he was trapped. The rain came down in sheets, drenching him to the bone. He had to find shelter. He scanned the forest around him, his eyes darting through the darkness, seeking the shape of something that could offer refuge. He didn't have much choice. He had no way of knowing how long the storm would last. He stumbled upon a small clearing and saw it, a cabin, weathered and worn, but solid enough to protect him from the storm. Relief flooded through him as he moved toward it, pushing through the heavy brush. The door creaked loudly as he shoved it open, stepping into the musty interior. The space was cramped and smelled of old wood and mildew. A single, dim light flickered above, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls. But it wasn't the cabin that unnerved him. It was the forest outside. He could hear it. The storm raged, yes, but something else, something unnatural, was in the air. A shifting presence that couldn't be explained, like the wind was carrying whispers, faint but unmistakable. Then, from somewhere outside, he heard it. A soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps. His blood ran cold. The storm howled outside, and his mind scrambled to dismiss the possibility of someone else being out there. Who would be out in this kind of weather? Who would dare to wander through the woods in the middle of a thunderstorm? He stepped cautiously to the window, pulling back the curtains to peer out into the darkness. The rain was thick, the trees barely visible in the downpour, but he could see them, eyes, glowing faintly from the distance, like distant fireflies or the shine of animal eyes in the night. But they weren't quite like any animal he'd seen before. There was something wrong about them, something otherworldly, the kind of glow that never felt natural. His heart pounded in his chest, but he told himself it was just the storm playing tricks on him. Maybe it was a reflection of the rain hitting a wet surface, or a trick of the light. He tried to breathe deeply, forcing his mind to stay rational, to stay calm. But then, another sound, a low, guttural growl. Not from an animal, but something deeper, something primal. His eyes darted back to the window, but the eyes in the distance were gone. A shadow passed through the trees, flickering and warping as though it was moving through water. He could have sworn it was watching him. He took a step back from the window, his body tense, every muscle on high alert. The air inside the cabin had thickened, heavy with an oppressive feeling that made it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the storm anymore. It was as if the very forest itself was alive, pressing against him, closing in from all sides. He took a few slow steps back into the cabin, feeling the weight of something unseen watching him, listening. The rain intensified, the wind howling louder as if in fury. But then, in the silence that followed, something even stranger began to happen. The walls of the cabin seemed to groan, as though the house itself was reacting to the storm. And then, footsteps. Closer this time. His breath hitched. They were inside. Or they were just outside, at the door. He didn't know which one was worse. Without thinking, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and pushed open the door, desperate to find out what was lurking in the forest. The cold air hit him like a slap, and he shivered involuntarily. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring everything in its path, but the trees, those towering giants, seemed to lean toward him, as if they were trying to hide something. He stepped carefully, the ground beneath his boots slick with mud, every movement feeling like it was being watched. The light from his flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift just out of his reach. That's when he saw them, symbols etched deeply into the bark of the trees. He stepped closer, brushing the wet bark with his fingers. The carvings were old, ancient even. Circles, lines, strange shapes that seemed to twist and writhe, as if they were alive. He stepped back, confusion and fear creeping into his mind. This was no random marking. This was something deliberate, something intentional, something that had been here long before he ever set foot in these woods. He moved deeper into the forest, compelled by an invisible force he couldn't resist. The symbols were everywhere, etched into the trees as far as he could see. He didn't know what they meant, but he could feel them. The air seemed charged, the very ground beneath his feet pulsing with energy, as though the forest itself had become a living entity. And then, suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. But no, it moved, slowly, deliberately. And then it stopped, just at the edge of his vision, standing in the heavy mist that had rolled in with the storm. Daniel's pulse raced. His throat went dry, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He was frozen. The figure was tall, its outline hazy, but there was no mistaking its shape. It was humanoid, but not quite human. Its limbs were long and twisted, and its face was obscured by shadow. But he could feel its gaze boring into him, cold and unyielding. "Get away," Daniel whispered to himself, though the words felt inadequate, as though they had no power here. The figure took a step forward. The rain seemed to part around it, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Daniel's body screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, the forest seemed to darken even more. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining as though trying to trap him. Suddenly, the figure lunged, its form stretching unnaturally, its eyes now glowing with a fierce, unnatural light. Daniel stumbled backward, tripping over the roots of a nearby tree, falling hard to the ground. He scrambled to get up, but something cold, something otherworldly, touched his shoulder. He spun around, and there it was. The figure stood right in front of him, towering above him, its long fingers reaching for his face, its mouth opening to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Its eyes were now wide and empty, two dark voids that seemed to swallow all light. Daniel's breath was shallow, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. He wanted to scream, to run, but his voice was gone. The storm raged on, but it felt distant now, a mere echo of the horror that surrounded him. The figure leaned in closer, its breath cold against his face, its voice a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here." And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving Daniel alone in the forest, the rain pouring down harder than ever. But the terror didn't fade. It lingered, a heavy weight pressing against him, and he knew, deep down, that whatever had just happened was far from over. He turned and ran, the symbols on the trees flashing in his mind, the figure's words echoing in his ears. But no matter how fast he ran, he could never escape the forest that seemed to be alive, watching, waiting. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, the kind of night where the world outside seemed distant, forgotten, as you wrapped yourself in the warmth and security of home. For Claire and Adam, it was just another night in their cozy cottage, nestled at the edge of a sleepy town. The storm had rolled in just after dinner, a sudden surge of wind and rain that rattled the windows, but, at first, seemed like nothing more than an ordinary downpour. The house felt snug, and they sat together on the couch, sipping tea and chatting about their day, the kind of conversation that came easy after years of marriage. But as the clock ticked past 8 o'clock, something began to shift in the air. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you might dismiss as your imagination. A slight chill that hadn't been there before, the hairs on the back of your neck standing up for no reason. Still, Claire pushed it aside, leaning into Adam's side as they watched the storm outside. The wind howled louder, pressing against the sides of the house, and the rain fell in sheets, blurring the world beyond their windows. The storm had become almost ferocious, the kind that made you feel small, as if the earth itself was shouting. Adam glanced at Claire, a small, reassuring smile on his lips. "It's just the storm," he said, his voice soft and steady, like the calm after the worst of a tempest. But then, just as the words left his mouth, Claire's attention snapped toward the window. There was a sound, soft, deliberate, and almost rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. She froze. Her gaze darted to the glass, and her breath caught in her throat. At first, she thought it was nothing, just the wind pushing a branch against the window, or maybe a stray raindrop hitting the sill. But the sound was too deliberate, too consistent to be ignored. Tap, tap, tap. She stood up slowly, her heart beginning to race as she moved toward the window. Adam was busy flipping through the pages of a book, not noticing the tension building in Claire's every move. As she peered out into the dark night, she saw nothing. Only the darkness of the storm and the faint glow of the streetlights far down the road. But the tapping continued. "Adam," she called softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you hear that?" Adam glanced up from his book, his face relaxed and comfortable. "It's probably just the wind," he said again, though there was a slight edge to his voice, as if he were trying to reassure himself as much as her. Claire took a breath, trying to calm the unsettling feeling stirring inside her. "Maybe," she replied, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She sat back down, trying to convince herself it was nothing. But the tapping didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. It was becoming harder to ignore. Claire turned to Adam once more, her brow furrowing. "I think I'll check outside," she said, her voice laced with unease. Adam looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "It's pouring out there, Claire. There's no one out there." But the tap, tap, tap continued, and the chill that had settled in the room seemed to grow colder with each passing second. Claire felt a strange compulsion to check. She couldn't explain it, but something was calling her to investigate. She made her way to the window, Adam following her cautiously. As they peered out into the darkness, the tap stopped abruptly. Claire blinked, confused. The rain continued to lash against the glass, the wind howling, but there was no one there. The yard was empty, just the flickering shadows of the trees bending in the gusts of wind. "See? There's nothing," Adam said with a small, sarcastic laugh, trying to ease the tension. But Claire didn't respond. She could feel it now, the way the air had thickened, the eerie stillness that had descended on the room. It was as if the storm had paused, holding its breath. Then, just as Adam was about to turn away, the tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. Claire gasped. She turned back to the window, her heart hammering in her chest, her hands gripping the sill so tightly her knuckles turned white. This time, she saw it. A figure, standing motionless on the other side of the glass, drenched to the bone, its silhouette barely visible against the storm. It was a tall figure, almost unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch out too far, too thin. The figure's head was tilted slightly to one side, and its eyes, if they were eyes, shone through the darkness, reflecting the dim light from the house like two cold, gleaming orbs. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Her heart skipped a beat, her body frozen with terror. She couldn't look away from the figure, though every fiber of her being screamed for her to turn, to run, to hide. The tapping had stopped, but now the figure stood, unmoving, staring into their home with an unnerving stillness. "Adam," she whispered, her voice shaking, her fingers trembling as she pointed at the window. Adam followed her gaze, his face faltering as his eyes locked on the figure. "There's nothing there," he said, his voice uncertain now, though he had tried to remain calm. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she pulled away from the window, her mind racing. "No, Adam, there's someone out there. I saw them, right there, standing by the window." She could feel her words becoming frantic, her panic creeping into her voice. Adam stepped closer, squinting into the rain. The figure was gone. The window was empty. But Claire knew what she had seen. The icy sensation in her veins told her that she had not imagined it. She could still feel the presence of that figure, looming in the storm, watching them. "You're just tired," Adam said, his tone dismissive as he placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her down. "It's been a long day. Maybe it's the storm playing tricks on your mind." But Claire couldn't shake the feeling. She stood there, staring out into the rain, feeling the weight of being watched, a presence in the darkness, just beyond their reach. The storm outside intensified, but inside the house, the tension thickened, choking the air around them. Adam sat back down, though the unease was still palpable in his movements, his gaze darting uneasily to the window every few seconds, as if expecting to see something there. They tried to go back to their evening. Adam picked up his book again, but the words didn't register. Claire sat down next to him, her mind still trapped in the moments she had witnessed. She couldn't shake the sense of unease, the knowing that something was wrong, that something was out there. She couldn't ignore the hollow feeling in her chest, as if there was a dark presence lurking, just out of sight. Hours passed, and the storm raged on. But every so often, Claire would glance toward the window, her gaze drawn toward the darkened glass, half expecting to see that figure standing there again, staring into their home with those glowing eyes. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, it happened again. The tapping returned. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was louder, more urgent. Claire stood up, her eyes wide with fear. She reached for Adam, but he was already moving to the window, his face pale, his breath shallow. Outside, through the rain-soaked glass, the figure was there again, standing motionless, just as before, its hollow eyes glowing in the storm. Claire's heart raced in her chest as she whispered, "It's back. It's back again." And this time, the figure didn't disappear. It stepped forward, its thin, wet hands pressed against the window, leaving streaks of condensation. Its eyes never left them, staring deep into their souls, silent and still, as if it was waiting for something. For them. The room grew colder. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming now. And as the figure remained at the window, Adam and Claire knew, without a doubt, that this visitor was not just a figment of their imagination. It was something far darker, far more sinister than they could have ever feared. It was a night like any other, the kind where the world outside seemed far away, and the house was wrapped in the cocoon of safety and warmth. But in the small, quiet town, nestled at the edge of the woods, something far more sinister was beginning to stir. Inside the house, a family slept peacefully, unaware of the growing tension in the air. The Johnsons, a mother, father, and their young daughter Emma, had lived here for several years now. It was an old house, with creaking floors and long, shadowy hallways, the kind of house where the past seemed to whisper through the cracks in the walls. But it had always felt safe. A home for Emma, who had grown up here, surrounded by love and warmth. But that night, everything changed. Emma awoke in the dead of night, her tiny face scrunched with confusion. The house was still, save for the steady rhythm of the rain against the windows. Yet something was different, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She sat up in bed, her little feet touching the cold floor, and listened intently. It was faint at first, like a distant murmur, but as the wind howled outside, the soft, melodic notes grew louder, clearer. It was a lullaby, soft, lilting, and sweet. The kind of song that a mother would sing to a child, gentle and calming. But there was something deeply wrong about it. The voice that carried the melody was distant, as though it was coming from far away. But it was not the voice of her mother. It was not the voice of anyone she knew. Emma's heart raced, her small hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her blanket. She looked to the door of her bedroom, where the dim light from the hallway seeped through the crack. The house was quiet. No one else seemed to be awake. The lullaby continued, the haunting melody floating through the darkness, winding its way into Emma's mind like a ghostly whisper. She couldn't place the words, and yet they felt so familiar, as though they were speaking directly to her heart. "Mom?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling as she pulled the covers tightly around her small body. Her mother stirred in the next room, but the lullaby persisted, growing louder as the rain intensified outside. Emma's curiosity overcame her fear. She slowly swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet making no sound as she padded quietly down the hallway. The lullaby seemed to guide her, its gentle melody beckoning her forward, leading her deeper into the house. She followed it, instinctively, drawn by something she couldn't explain. Her tiny fingers brushed against the cool walls as she passed, and with each step, the song became clearer, more distinct. When Emma reached the living room, she paused, her breath shallow as the lullaby wrapped around her, filling the entire space. The melody seemed to pulse, resonating with an eerie sense of purpose, but there was no one in sight. "Mom?" she called again, her voice a fragile tremor. Her mother's voice came from the bedroom, distant and muffled. "What is it, sweetie? Go back to bed. It's just the storm." But Emma could hear the worry in her mother's tone, as if she, too, could sense something was wrong. Ignoring the call, Emma continued to follow the lullaby, which now led her toward the hallway. As she passed the old wooden stairs, the door at the end of the hall caught her eye. It was the door that had always been locked, always sealed off. Her parents had told her it was just a storage room full of old furniture and things they didn't use. But Emma had always been curious. She had always wondered what was behind it, what lay behind the walls of the house that they never talked about. And now, the lullaby seemed to be coming from behind that door. The key was in the drawer, just where it always had been. Emma had never been allowed to touch it, but tonight it was as if something was guiding her. She reached for the key, her fingers trembling, and slid it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty room beyond. The lullaby was louder now, more insistent, as if it was waiting for her. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the smell of old wood and forgotten memories. The room was filled with furniture covered in white sheets, like ghosts of the past, left undisturbed for years. But in the corner of the room, there was something else, something darker, something far more sinister. Emma stepped closer, drawn by the lullaby. Her feet felt heavy as though the air around her was thick with a strange, unseen force. She reached the corner of the room and stopped dead in her tracks. Her breath caught in her throat. There, in the corner of the room, was an old rocking chair. The chair moved slowly, back and forth, creaking with each motion, as though something, or someone, was sitting in it. And in the shadows beyond the chair, Emma could make out the faint outline of a figure. It was a woman, her back to Emma, humming the lullaby. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, blending into the darkness around her. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She felt a strange pull toward the woman, but she couldn't bring herself to move closer. She stood frozen, her eyes wide, unable to look away. "Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman did not answer, only continued to rock slowly, humming the lullaby. The song seemed to seep into Emma's soul, making her feel both comforted and terrified at the same time. It was a song she had never heard, but it felt so familiar, so close to her heart. And then the woman stopped rocking. The lullaby stopped. Emma's heart thudded in her chest as the silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. She didn't know what to do, whether to run or stay. Her body felt heavy, rooted to the spot. And then the figure slowly turned. Her face was pale, almost lifeless, her eyes hollow and dark, as if there was no soul left inside. She smiled at Emma, but the smile was wrong, distorted, twisted, a grin that did not belong on a human face. The woman opened her mouth, but instead of words, a cold, hollow sound emerged, a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." Emma stumbled backward, her body trembling with fear. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat. Her eyes flicked to the doorway, to the hallway beyond, where the light from the rest of the house seemed so far away. The woman in the chair rose slowly, her movements jerky, unnatural. "You shouldn't have heard the song." Emma turned and ran, her feet pounding against the floor, her heart racing. She could hear the soft tapping of footsteps behind her, following her down the hallway. But when she looked back, no one was there. She reached the living room, gasping for breath, and found her parents standing in the doorway, their faces pale and worried. "Emma, where have you been? What's wrong?" her mother asked, rushing to her side. The lullaby had stopped, but Emma couldn't explain what had happened. She couldn't put into words the terror she had felt, the dark figure in the room, the lullaby that had led her there. She only knew one thing for certain. Something had awakened in that room. something that had been waiting for years, something that would never let them go. And the lullaby. The lullaby would never stop. The rain came down in sheets, drenching everything in sight. The street lights flickered like dying stars, their light warped by the torrents of water pouring from the heavens. The man, Alex, pulled his collar up against the cold, his footsteps echoing in the empty street as he hurried home. There was something unsettling about the night. The weight of the storm felt oppressive, a constant reminder that something was lurking just beyond his reach, in the shadow of the rain and the relentless wind. Alex had been walking for nearly half an hour, his shoes soaked through, when he spotted it, a figure standing still under a street lamp, draped in a long raincoat, the hood pulled low over their face. They were motionless, as though frozen in time, staring straight ahead. Alex's heart skipped a beat. It was strange. The figure was completely out of place on the empty, rain-slicked street. No one else was around, and the city felt like a forgotten ghost town, abandoned in the storm's fury. He tried to shake off the sense of unease that prickled at the back of his neck. Just someone waiting for the rain to pass, he told himself. But the figure didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. Alex hesitated, then decided to keep walking. He told himself it was nothing, just an odd moment, a random person waiting for the storm to subside. He quickened his pace, hoping to make it home without further incident. But when he glanced back, his stomach twisted. The figure was no longer standing under the street lamp. They were now following him, trailing at a slow, deliberate pace. There was no sound, no footsteps, just a silent pursuit. Alex's pulse quickened, his breath shallow as he turned down another street, but the figure was still there, always at the edge of his vision, never speeding up or slowing down, keeping the same even pace, as though they had all the time in the world. His heart hammered in his chest, and a sense of dread crept into his mind. It's not possible. He turned around again. The figure was closer now, almost within arm's reach, but it still didn't make a sound. No footfalls, no rustling of fabric. Nothing. Just the sound of the rain pattering against the pavement, and his own erratic breathing. Alex quickened his pace again, his legs aching from the sudden rush. But when he glanced over his shoulder this time, the figure was still there, mere steps behind him. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, thicker. It felt like the rain itself was pressing in on him, suffocating him with its weight. He wanted to call out, to scream for help, but the words caught in his throat. The quiet was maddening, stretching on too long, and as he turned yet again, the figure was there, directly in front of him now, blocking his path. For the first time, Alex saw their face, or, rather, what should have been a face. The figure's face was obscured by the hood, but the faint outline of a gaunt, skeletal jawline and hollow eyes could be seen through the fabric, like a faint memory of a person once alive. Alex froze, his legs trembling beneath him, unable to move, unable to tear his gaze away from those empty sockets staring back at him. "You shouldn't have come this way," the figure whispered, the words soft but filled with a cold, venomous anger. The voice was unfamiliar, but there was something about it that seemed too familiar, too personal. It made his skin crawl, a voice that pulled at his deepest fears, reminding him of something long buried in the recesses of his mind. What do you want?" Alex stammered, his throat dry, his voice shaking. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, studying him with those hollow eyes. Then It took a step closer, and Alex stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. No, 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 he thought desperately. This can't be happening. It can't be real. Do you remember me? The figure's voice was colder now, laced with something darker, something that felt like malice. Alex's heart stopped. His mind raced, but he couldn't place the voice, couldn't place the figure. Who is this? Who are you? The figure reached up slowly, pulling back the hood just enough for Alex to see the face beneath. And in that moment, the world seemed to crash around him. It was a face he recognized all too well, a face he had hoped never to see again. The face of a man he had once known, someone from his past, someone he had wronged, someone whose life he had destroyed with his own selfishness. The face was pale, gaunt, skin stretched tight over the skull, eyes hollow as though they had been drained of all humanity. It was Thomas. Thomas, his old friend from years ago, the one he had betrayed, the one who had disappeared without a trace, the man who had been his best friend and whose death had been ruled an accident, though Alex knew it wasn't. You killed him, the voice inside Alex's head whispered. You killed him, and now he's here to make you pay. I didn't mean it, Alex whispered, his voice barely a breath. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Please, I'm sorry. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it took another step forward, and then another, its movements unnervingly slow, deliberate. Alex felt his back hit the cold, wet brick of a building, trapping him. He tried to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate, as though the very air had turned to stone, weighing him down. You can't run from what you've done, Thomas said, his voice now harsh, distorted by the sound of the rain, but still unmistakably the same. You'll never outrun me, Alex. With a sudden, jarring movement, the figure lunged forward, grabbing hold of Alex's wrist with a grip that felt like ice. Alex gasped, his body jerking in shock as the figure's fingers seemed to sink into his flesh, cold and unrelenting. The figure's face twisted into a sickening grin, its eyes gleaming with malice. You should have never come back. You never should have come back to this place, the figure hissed. And Alex felt himself being pulled forward, dragged into the downpour, the world around him spinning as the rain seemed to drown out everything else. The storm howled around them, the sound deafening. And yet, even over the roar of the wind and rain, Alex could hear Thomas's voice, low, mocking, and full of fury, echoing in his ears. You're mine now, Alex, forever. As the final echoes of the storm fade, we reflect on the chilling tales that unraveled tonight. Each story, from the quiet woods to the quiet corners of a home, shows us that the true horrors aren't always what we can see. No, the real terrors linger just out of sight, like whispers on the wind, hidden in the folds of the night. We think we're safe, surrounded by the world we know. But the rain, the storm, and the silence, they all hide something far darker, waiting to be uncovered. We've traveled through strange forests, faced unearthly visitors, and stood face to face with our past mistakes. But this isn't the end. The rain never stops. It's just waiting for the next story to be told. The rain is far from over, my friends. There are still many stories out there, hidden in the dark, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. And who knows? You may be next to hear them, when the storm is at its fiercest. If tonight's tales have left you trembling, if the rain's whispers still echo in your mind, then don't let the story end here. Like, subscribe, and comment below. What do you think is lurking in the rain? Share your scariest rainy night experience, your own chilling encounter, in the comments. We'd love to hear what you've felt lurking in the dark corners of the storm. And remember, the rain may stop, but the stories, they never truly end.